Hi everyone, thanks a lot for watching this short video around Google Cloud Platform Identity and Access Management. If you guys have any questions or want me to cover any of the topics around three major cloud providers, AWS, Azure, and GCP Iam, please feel free to put it in the comment section. So without further ado, let's kickstart the today's session on GCP Iam. In terms of the RBAC, GCP has got 4 Ws: who, what, which, and where. Whereas on the identity side or who GCP, they call it principles. Your identity primarily exists in your Google identity or Google workspace. So most common of the identity type is called user or groups. So whereas if we combine what and which in Google, they call it role. Roles are nothing but it's a collection of permission. And then in the last, they call it a scope. Scope is nothing but where you want to assign these roles and at what level. So GCP RBAC is pretty similar to Azure RBAC in case you're pretty familiar with Microsoft Azure. So let's go through all the possible types of GCP principles or identity. The first one is called Google account. In short, any email ID tied to Google account is considered as identity. Or in other way around, you can easily provide an access of any of your GCP project organizations or folder to any of your personal Gmail account. The second one is called Google Groups. So it is nothing but a collection of multiple Google identities or accounts. Kindly note that so Google Groups doesn't have any kind of a login credentials at all. So compared to Google users. The third one is called service account. So here, rather than assigning an access to your users, you would like to provide an access to your machines to interact with the cloud resources. So GCP service accounts, it primarily exists in the GCP project. The fourth one is called Google Workspace or G Suite. All your identities, G Suite, domain users or groups, they primarily get created there. Continuing on the GCP principles, similar to Google Workspace, your identity can be stored in the Google Cloud Identity. Again, I haven't got a chance to deep dive yet on the cloud identity side of the world. But what I read that cloud identity domain user licenses are much cheaper compared to the Workspace, as Workspace provide a lot of features, including their Workspace IDP, including the Workspace Gmail and a couple of other applications. The next one is called all authenticated user. Here, what it means, any users or machine authenticated with Google can access your resources, including your personal Gmail account. The last one is called all user. It includes any authenticated or unauthenticated users. So throughout today's video, we will be deep diving a bit more on some of these important principles. So first, let's look into the GCP users. So GCP users are being primarily managed in your G Suite, Google Workspace, or the Google Identity side of the world. If you look at the screenshot pasted here, in this screenshot, you can see I created this user, the user called like sales@sesolutionsdemo.com. This user was created using my GCP, my Google admin console, my Google Workspace admin console. Kindly note that the users don't get created in the GCP projects or the folders or the organizations. So this is a little bit about GCP user. Second thing is similar to GCP users, GCP groups also you need to create it in the Google Workspace or G Suite side of the world. So again, it cannot be created on the Google Cloud Organizations folder or the projects. One thing to take note that your Google Workspace can include external identities. In my case, if you see, there are two different users. The first user is my super admin account. The second user is my personal testing Gmail account. In a idealistic scenario, if you think about it, you should always be assigning the permissions or the roles to the Google Workspace groups rather than assigning the roles to each and every individual users. If your organization is very big, assigning the user to the individual users gets pretty cumbersome. Now let's look into the service account, as it is one of the most important identity type. Service account primarily comes into picture for the application identities. Again, you can attach the service account to your virtual machine, your cloud function, or the Lambda, etc. Service account, unlike the users, don't have any kind of a passwords at all. However, within the service account, you can create a private public key pairs if any external identities sitting outside your Google, they want to interact with the Google Cloud resources. Kindly note that whenever you create these private public key pair, you want to secure it. In case attacker get hold of these private keys, they will be able to authenticate, and depending upon the role assigned to the service account, they will be able to own your infrastructure. Last thing is, users or other service accounts can impersonate a service account. In this case, if you think about it, one of your service account is going to act like an identity, and other service account is going to act like a resource. So let's see, where do you create this service account, just to be very clear. So here is one of the examples how I created one of the service account named Raj Test Service Account. So what you have to do, you have to simply go to one of your GCP projects. That's where you will be creating your service account. Then let's look into different types of service account present in Google Cloud. The first category is called user managed service account. As the name suggests, it is fully created and managed by users. And depending upon the kind of resources your machine or application want to have an access, so you will be assigning the appropriate permissions, and you can easily work upon a least privilege principle. So typically, these service accounts are being named as service account name at the rate of project id.iam.gserviceaccount.com. So you can name your service account whatever you like. Second category is called default service account. It gets created behind the scenes whenever you are enabling a service API for compute, app engine, etc. And by default, these service account gets editor permissions, which is too broad. And these accounts are being named as project ID at the rate of appspot.gserviceaccount.com or the project number compute at the rate of developer.gserviceaccount.com. Again, we will be deep diving a little bit more onto these default service account and how you should be securing it using the GCP guardrails. The last category is called Google managed service account only. So as the name suggests, so behind the scene, Google service has to act on your behalf. So that's where the service account gets used. And typically these service accounts also gets very broad permissions. And it is typically named as project number at the rate of cloudservices.gserviceaccount.com. So this is a little bit about three different kind of a service accounts. So let's look into the roles. So GCP roles are nothing but it's a collection of permissions. So here on the screenshot I pasted, you can see the role name is compute instance admin, and it has got a bunch of all these permissions like get, list, delete, start, stop, type, and so on. So role is nothing but a collection of permissions. One thing to take note, you cannot assign these permissions directly to the GCP identities or the principal. Only roles can be assigned. There are three different kinds of roles exist in GCP: basic roles, predefined roles, last is the custom roles. So let's look into all these roles one by one. So first, let's look into the GCP basic role. Some people call it primitive roles because it came into existence before the introduction of identity access management. The first role is called viewer. As the name suggests, it is primarily meant to viewing purposes only. But this specific role has more than 2,600 permissions. It's way more than any reader role can have all these set of permissions. The second role is called editor. As the name suggests, it can help you to modify the existing state and can help you to create and delete resources for most of the GCP services. And this specific role has more than 5,300 permissions. The last role is called owner. It can help you to manage IAM roles, permissions. It can help you to set up billing, and it can help you to perform all the actions can be done by your editor role. So one final key takeaway, what Google recommends and most of the security organizations recommend, including CyberArk, is to stay away from the basic roles and always try to leverage upon predefined or the custom roles. So let's look into the predefined roles. So GCP predefined roles, they can provide a granular access compared to the basic roles. And it is created primarily looking at a specific service or the job function. In GCP, you can have more than 1,000 plus predefined roles. All these roles are fully managed and maintained by Google. So at any given point of a time, new permissions or new services being added. So GCP will go ahead and add or remove the new services or the new permissions behind the scenes. And so many times, if your principal is performing two different roles, for example, somebody is a compute admin and somebody is a storage admin as well, you can attach these multiple predefined role to your GCP principal. Then another thing is you should be assigning this role to the lowest level scope. So that's where the resource hierarchy comes into picture. So at later part of my slide, we will be discussing into these resource hierarchy. So these roles, these predefined roles are generally good enough for most of the organization to start with. And slowly you can move to the custom roles as your organization is going to get mature, as they will have a better understanding what are the permissions being really used by your GCP principal. So let's look into the GCP custom roles. So here is the whole idea with the GCP custom role is you can decide what kind of permissions really required by your users, by your groups, or by your service accounts. These roles are being fully maintained and managed by your organization itself. So what it means, at any given point of a time, even if Google is adding new set of permissions, if Google is adding a new set of services, you have to go and make all these appropriate changes using manually automated or some API-based methodology. Again, like a predefined role, you should be assigning these roles to the lowest level scope possible so that you shouldn't be granting excessive privileges to any of your GCP principal. Then with the help of the role recommender, with the help of the CIAM tools, so slowly you can take away all these excessive permissions. Again, it is a continuous journey to take away the excessive permissions what your principals doesn't want. and doesn't need. One last thing to take note, there are few set of permissions present in GCP which is not supported within the custom rules. For such kind of permissions, if you really require it, then you have to leverage upon predefined roles only. So this is how the GCP resource hierarchy or scope looks like. It is very important to understand where you should be assigning a specific role, as roles get inherited to the child resources as well. The top layer is called organizations. So that is going to be your Google Workspace or Google Identity domain, or organization can be called as root node in the hierarchy as well. The second one is called folder. The folders are children of your organization, or some people call this folder as an organizational unit as well. Basically, you can create OU per group in your organization. In this picture, you can see there are 3 different OUs: human resources, engineering, and sales. The third layer is called project. That's where all your resources are going to reside within the project. So GCP project can be equivalent to your AWS account or Azure subscription. So when it comes to assigning the roles, you can assign the roles at a different level. Again, as I mentioned earlier, you should be assigning the role at the lowest level scope possible, so that we shouldn't be granting too many permissions to your GCP principals. So this is how the resource hierarchy looks like. So this screenshot comes from my own personal Google organization. At the top, you see I got my own Google Workspace domain that is called sesolutionsdemo.com. Below that, I got 2 different folders. One is for test, other is for production. And below the prod, I got like 2 subscription. And in test environment, I got just 1 subscription or 1 project. So let's look into the GCP Iam policy, or GCP call it a allow policy. The first thing we have to understand is role binding. Role binding is nothing but when you bind the role to the specific principle. Allow policy is nothing but it's a collection of the role bindings, and it can be attached to your resource hierarchy, what we just talked about. Again, you can assign this Iam policy, allow policy at the organization level, folder level, project level, or at the specific resource. So let's see how these allow policy inheritance going to look like. So this is an example from my own personal GCP environment. Here we are looking at one of the project named my first project. The first set of role bindings get inherited from the organization level, which is sesolutionsdemo.com. The second set is from the folder level named as prod environment. The last one is nothing but what assigned directly at the project level. So let's look into the GCP role binding at the organization level, to what all principle you can attach these roles to. So here, so once you click on the question mark, you will see that two main findings. The first finding is you can assign these roles or these permissions to your personal Gmail account. Again, it is very different from AWS and Azure way of providing an access. If you think about it, anyone authorized can simply provide an access to their own personal Gmail account, and then they can do whatever they want. So later on, we will be looking into what best can be done to counter this issue. One more thing you can notice, that you can assign the access to your entire Google Workspace domain. So what it means, any user present in your Google Workspace directory, they will have an access to your GCP resources, which may not be a good thing at all. Now, let's look into the GCP role bindings or the principles at the bucket level or equivalent to AWS S3 bucket. So here are two main key things to take note. The first one is anybody. What does GCP mean by anybody? Anyone can access your information, whether they are authenticated or not. It's like opening your buckets to the public. Second one is called all authenticated user. Anyone authenticated with Google, including your own personal Gmail account, can access this specific bucket. So by default, so whenever Google tries to create a default service account, so whenever you are enabling a compute APIs, what Google is going to do behind the scenes, it will be assigning a editor role. If you recall, editor role has got way more permissions, what really required by your application resources or your compute admin or your virtual machine. Apologies, not a compute admin. So here, so what's going to happen whenever you will be spinning off a new virtual machine or a new compute instance? So by default, the Google will assign a default service account, what has been created. And if you think about it indirectly, this instance will get editor permissions. So later on, we will be looking into some of the guardrails, what GCP provides to eliminate this problem to a great extent. So that's how the kind of permissions are going to be too many. So let's look into some of the guardrails, what GCP provides. And also we will go through some of the recommendations GCP provides from a least privilege standpoint. So in GCP within the IAM, they provide a feature called GCP Organization Policy Service. So what it's supposed to do that, you can set up few guardrails so that you can stay compliant and you can reduce your entire attack surface area. Some of the very common use cases around these organizations policies are, the first one is you can really restrict an access to a specific domain. If you want to block any user accessing your Google Workspace resources or any user providing an access to the Gmail account or something, if you want to block it. So using this limit resource sharing on the domain, you will be able to do that. The second thing is, if your organization is running a business just in, for example, in Europe, and you really want to restrict your user to spin off any kind of resources outside Europe region, that's where you can leverage upon this policy. The third use case is if you want to disable the creation of a new service account or something like that. So that's where you can leverage upon some of these organization policies. The last but not the least is many times you simply want to disallow any kind of a service account, private and public key creation. That's where you can leverage upon this organization policy. Let's look into some of these guardrails. The first one is disabling the service account key creation. By default, anyone authorized can create the keys and then they can post it on the GitHub or somewhere else. In short, if attacker get hold of these keys, they will be able to authenticate and then they will be able to control your environment. It's one of the best practice in Google to disable this service account key creation if it is not really required. So that's where Google provides one of the out-of-the-box guardrail. You simply have to enforce it at the organization, folder, or the project level. Then it will trickle down to all the children. So here what I did, I simply enforced this disable service account key creation at the organization level. And then when I tried creating the keys for my Raj test service account, so I got an error. I got a pop-up that hey, service account creation, key creation is disabled. So this is how you can leverage upon this specific guardrail. Going to the second guardrail, if you remember, we talked about it, you may be able to provide an access to your GCP organization folder or the project to your Gmail account. So here using this enable domain level restriction, you will be able to restrict or you will be able to restrict the access just to your own Google Workspace only. So here what I did, so I simply allow an access to my own Google Workspace user and groups only. Anything outside is blocked. So once I enforce this policy, then what I did, I tried providing access to my test Gmail account, and I got an error that this IAM policy update has been failed. So this is how the guardrail is going to look like. Then the third one is third thing, when we notice that, so many times whenever the default service account get created, by default they get a editor role, which is too many permissions. So that's where Google provides an out-of-the-box organization policy. So where you can simply disable the automatic IAM grants. So what I did, I simply enable this policy at the organization level. And once I did that, so when my new Google default service account for compute gets created, by default it is not getting any kind of a role. So this is another thing. Then what GCP provides, so GCP has come up with a new policy, they call it a deny policy. At this stage, it is in a preview stage. So this is how this entire evaluation process is gonna look like. So let's take an example. If principal wants to perform a certain action, so what Google is going to check, Google is going to check the deny policy first. If the deny policy is attached, if it is restricting that principal cannot perform XYZ step, then their request is simply going to be denied. And in the GCP, it is not going to check further whether it is allowed or not. So this is how this entire evaluation process going to look like. So last thing is within the GCP, one thing comes out very handy is called GCP Iam recommenders. So by default, GCP keeps on providing the recommendation. So in my case, if you look at the security inside, it is providing you a decent information. Hey, for this particular entity or principal, it is using only for example, 10 out of like 23 permission out of this custom CM role assigned to one of my service account. Then the question comes whether this specific entity really needs all these permissions or not. So that's where if you drill down further, GCP will be able to provide the entire details about what are the permissions being used and what are the permissions are called excessive permissions. Again, so we will be creating another set of a video around the GCP best practices and around the GCP Iam recommenders at a later point of a time, because it requires 30 minutes to 40 minutes to cover this entire topic in a lot more detail. So I think that's it from my side for today's presentation. Please feel free to provide any kind of a comments or feedback if you have any. So thanks a lot, everyone, for watching this short video.